Hello, everyone. Can you see us all? Simple yes, that would be great. Awesome. Thank you, Nelson. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to part 5 of the Celo Tech Talks series. I'm Judy Piper. I am an engineering partner at C Labs. At C Labs, we are working on a mobile-first full-stack blockchain platform, Celo, with a mission to build a financial system that creates the conditions of prosperity for everyone. To help achieve this mission, I'm currently based out in Berlin to lead and grow engineering team here. I'm also the host for this Tech Talk series with the goal to provide a series of educational sessions to help share knowledge and expertise around the building Celo with the community. For those who missed the previous sessions, we have recordings available on Celo Foundation's Crowdcast as well as on our YouTube channel. I'll be sending out a follow-up email after this talk. In it, you will find helpful links to learn more about Celo and how you can reach us. You will also find a link to the feedback survey form. So please don't forget to share your feedback so we can continue to improve our content and keep them relevant to this learning community. And I'm super excited to have my colleague Roman Crossman joining us today to talk about Celo's stability protocol and what the team at C Labs has been working on to provide stability of the economic value on Celo. Roman, we've been working together for a while now and in Berlin team. And you know, the protocol economics team's been growing pretty rapidly this year. And now you lead the protocol economics team. So I think it would be helpful to the audience if you could share who you are and what you do, and perhaps how you joined the C Labs and what got you interested in working on Celo.
Yeah, thanks, Judy, for the very nice introduction, and also welcome everybody from my side. Yeah, as Judy said, I work on protocol economics related topics here at C Labs, and I'm happy to share a bit of background on myself and how I ended up working on Celo. Yeah, my background, I think in general, is pretty mixed. I studied some economics and some electrical engineering, ended up pursuing a PhD in quant finance after that, and then worked in financial engineering. So I guess my background really is a mix of financial mathematics, economics, and engineering. And while I was working in financial engineering here in Germany, I heard about Celo through a friend. That was in early 2018, and yeah, the mission just got me hooked immediately. I felt like this is something where I could have a very positive impact on the lives of many. So I got super excited immediately, and then a couple of weeks later, our CTO and CEO, Marek and Renee, were actually in Berlin, so I had a chance to meet them. And I think at that point, I was already so sold on the project that I just prepared a lot of stuff to convince them during the meeting that I really am motivated to work on this. So I came with a bunch of Jupyter notebooks and all these things just to show kind of how much thought I've put into this already. And yeah, so I guess they had a pretty easy time selling this to me. And yeah, it was not only the mission that really got me so excited, but also the fact that I think Celo really combines all the things that I'm interested in like the perfect way. So the economics, the engineering, but also like the financial mathematics side of things are just present everywhere. And yeah, I'm really happy to be part of this team and work on such interesting topics. And yeah, today this talk will be about stability, so mainly the stability mechanism of Celo. And that's one of the things I spent a lot of time on since I joined C Labs then in mid-2018. To give a bit of an overview on what's coming your way, the agenda for today. What I want to do in this talk is to start as broad as it gets by really asking the very fundamental question, why do we even need stablecoins? And then talk a bit about kind of different categories and what type of a stablecoin Celo classifies as. And then go more into details and speak first a bit about the conceptual understanding of the Celo stability mechanism, so how it works from an intuitive perspective, before jumping into the actual implementation. As always, the implementation makes things a bit more complicated, and you discover a couple of things that you haven't thought of when you decide the concept. So I want to talk about all the components in the implementation and point out what their role is. After that, I want to discuss the most important parameters in the setup and show how they influence the stability characteristics of the whole system. And then in the very end, I want to give a quick outlook on what might be coming next, on improvement proposals already out there, on thoughts that are actively discussed on how we could improve this mechanism going forward. And also want to speak a bit about the general challenges that will just be around for years to come. All right, so let's start as broad as it gets. Why stablecoins? I'm sure many of you saw this slide somewhere else already in another presentation if you keep a close eye on Celo. But it's, I think, important to start with the mission here again. The Celo mission is to build a monetary system that creates conditions of prosperity for all. And I think it was clear from the beginning that it requires some stable value assets on this platform to make significant progress on that mission. So if you look at your original white paper, you will find a lot of references to Celo stablecoins already in there. I think founders immediately recognized that if you want to solve a lot of financial inclusion related use cases to make progress on that Celo mission, then you need stable value assets as an integral part of the system. If you think, for example, about remittances, well, if you don't have a stable value asset that you can send, then remittances all of a sudden in a digital way become less useful. Also, if you think about a use case of just storing value in a country where there's not a stable value currency available, then it's obviously an important factor to just have a stable value asset available on such a platform. So I think this was just recognized very early on, and that's why Celo comes with a stable value asset, a stable token, the Celo dollar, basically from the beginning as not only an additional feature on top of the platform, but as an integral part of the platform. Now, given that it seems important for the mission to have stable value assets on the platform, like the Celo dollar, the question was, what are the categories you could choose here? How should this, on a very high level, work on Celo? And the categories out there could be classified as follows. I think, leaving Celo aside for now, there are basically three major categories. And I want to keep this brief because I'm sure many of you have context on this already, but I think it's still important to quickly go through this to understand how the Celo system works. First of all, there are the fiat and commodity collateralized stablecoins, something like USDC, for example. Those stablecoins are very simple in the way they expand and contract monetary supply. So for example, if there's a USDC coin trading at $1.05 somewhere, you can probably just create a new USDC coin by sending a US dollar to some bank account and then sell it for $1.05. And thereby, basically, you have an incentive to create additional supply whenever the coin depegs upwards. So in general, a very simple expansion and contraction mechanism behind them, and I will speak more about that later. But obviously also some downsides to fiat-backed stablecoins because they basically are centralized by definition, right? You need US dollars, so you're very tied to the traditional financial system, and you just need bank accounts where these coins, where these US dollars live. So it's very hard or probably impossible to fully decentralize a system like that. So upsides, but also downsides to such a category. Then there are the crypto collateralized stablecoins. Probably DAI of Maker is the most prominent example here. They usually work in a way that you lock up some crypto collateral and thereby create a new stable token. If this collateral drops below a certain value threshold, then this would trigger a liquidation of the collateral, and this liquidation is basically used to buy back stable tokens, so to contract supply, basically. Much easier to decentralize, right? You don't need fiat currency in that. You don't need bank accounts or anything like that. Often with this category, it's hard to match really supply and demand effectively. and scalability is often an issue. So a couple of drawbacks that also lead to them being usually not as closely packed to the fiat currency as fiat-backed stablecoins are. They fluctuate a bit more usually in price. And the third category out there that you will find is what you could call a senior style stable token. An example here would be Terra. With a senior style stable token, the idea is basically that you create an additional asset on the platform that is supposed to absorb the volatility of the stable token. And you basically expand and contract stable token supply against this senior style asset that absorbs this volatility. What's nice about this category is that the mechanism in the way you do this basically can be pretty direct, but often the drawback is that the stability characteristics really depend a lot on the value of the senior style asset. Basically saying, if people lose trust in the value of the senior style asset, at some point you will not be able to buy back stable tokens with the senior style asset anymore. And then you can run into a long-term depegging case. So it's hard to diversify collateral risk basically in a stable token setup like that. So what we tried to do on Celo is to combine the nice characteristics from all of those three categories into a new setup. And therefore, basically what we came up with is something that you could categorize as a crypto-collateralized senior share hybrid. And what does that mean? So basically, there are crypto assets in the reserve backing the token, crypto assets that are not native to the platform. For example, Bitcoin you will find in the Celo reserve. There is also a senior style asset in the reserve that is allowing to expand and contract supply against this token. And then additionally, we wanted to take the nice properties of fiat-backed stablecoins and basically build a mechanism which is as close as possible to how fiat-backed stablecoins work in terms of expanding and contracting monetary supply. So I think we really tried to take all the nice properties of these different categories and combine them to the best of our knowledge. Now, this shows roughly in which category the Celo stable tokens fall. And I want to give a bit more insight into the conceptual idea behind the Celo stability mechanism right now. Before we jump into that, let's quickly talk about a helpful economic framework in which we can analyze stable tokens. So we even know what it means if a stable token depegs in a certain direction. And the most useful model, I think, here is just a simple supply and demand argument. So let's assume that there is a demand curve for Celo dollars, and that this blue line depicts this demand curve. A demand curve like that basically shows how many units the market wants to hold for a certain price. So the blue line here, for example, says that at a price of 1, the market wants to hold 20 million Celo dollars, okay, just as an example. Now, if there are less than 20 million Celo dollars outstanding, then you will probably be somewhere off the price of 1 because you are not at this point where the supply side and the demand side intersect at the price of 1. So basically going through the case here of the orange vertical line. So let's say we have 90 million Celo dollar supply out there. The price at which, or the quantity at which the price of the demand curve is 1 is actually 20 million. So we're basically 1 million short on supply. Well, what this will lead to is a price which is somewhere above 1. There's less supply that people want to hold at a price of 1. So the price that you will see as a clearing price in the market will be somewhere above 1. Where exactly it will be, that's hard to say because that depends on the shape and slope of the demand curve. But since the demand curve should be downward sloping, it should be somewhere above 1. And you could have the counter case here if there's too much supply. So let's say there would be 21 million Celo dollar supply. So drawing a vertical line here at 21 million, you will likely find the price below 1. And this model also makes clear that, what do stability mechanisms have to achieve? Not only on Celo, but basically in every protocol that tries to achieve a peg. Well, the protocol basically needs to make sure that the supply is matching the demand side. So if the supply is 90 million, but the peg would be guaranteed at 20 million, this protocol needs to figure out how to basically bring an additional 1 million into supply. And if the case is that you're at 21 million, but the peg would hold at 20 million supply, then the protocol needs to contract supply somehow and basically get this additional 1 million out of the market. And that's really the goal of pretty much every stability mechanism, to make sure that these supply adjustments in response to changes in demand are happening in a robust, secure, and smooth way. So I said earlier that what we wanted to do for the Celo stability mechanism was, from a first idea, we wanted to be as close as possible to how fiat-backed stablecoins work in this expansion contraction regard. And to get this as a starting point, let's quickly chat about how fiat-backed stablecoins actually do that. Because it's a bit subtle, it's somewhat obvious, but it's probably not something you directly think about if you think about fiat-backed stablecoins. So let's say a fiat-backed stablecoin, let's pick USDC as an example, it's trading at $1.05. Then there's basically an arbitrage incentive present, because if you can create a new USDC coin by sending $1 to some bank account, then you as a user should do that, create this one USDC coin for $1, and then sell it on the market for $1.05. And thereby you can basically pocket the difference of 5 cents. The other way around, of course, in a contraction case, if the price is 95 cents, you could buy up that USDC coin, send it to a certain address that will then make sure that you get wired $1 to your bank account. So very direct way of expanding supply if the price is above the peg, and contracting supply if the price is below the peg. So exactly the picture we talked about, and exactly the reaction we want from a stability protocol. Now, because we wanted to build something very decentralized, we cannot use USD in the setup. So the question basically was, how can we do something as similar as possible without touching USD in the process? And the idea simply is that you substitute $1 in the setup for $1 worth of collateral. That's pretty much it from a high-level idea. So how does that work on Celo, conceptually speaking? So let's say a Celo dollar is trading at $1.05. Well, what a user could do is, this user could now go to the market and buy a Celo token for $1. Let's assume the price is 5. This person would get 0.2 Celo then. It could send this $1 worth of Celo to the reserve, and the reserve would hand out one freshly minted Celo dollar to that user. This user could now sell the Celo dollar on the market for $1.05 and again pocket this 5 cent difference, just as in the fiat-backed stablecoin case. So it's pretty much the same arbitrage cycle. It just has to go through an additional step, which is basically converting into the units of the reserve collateral, Celo tokens in this case. How does a contraction work in this setup? Well, because you can get $1 worth of collateral for your Celo dollar. If a Celo dollar is trading at 95 cents, which from a demand and supply perspective would mean there are too many out there, we need to contract supply. Then, well, a user just has an incentive to buy the Celo dollar at 95 cents, sell it to the reserve, get $1 worth of collateral for it, and then sell this $1 worth of collateral on the open market to basically complete this arbitrage cycle and pocket 5 cents profit. So from a conceptual understanding, this is very similar to how fiat-backed stablecoins work, just with the change that a US dollar is substituted by $1 worth of reserve collateral. Now, things are always more complicated if you think about them more deeply. So this is a simplification. There are two major things that make this harder as it looks now in these figures. First of all, to be able to hand out $1 worth of reserve collateral on the blockchain to somebody who sends a Celo dollar to the reserve, you need to know what $1 worth of collateral actually means. How many Celo tokens is $1 worth of collateral? To be able to compute that, you need a Celo US dollar oracle rate. And this is not natively available on the blockchain. You have to bring it to the blockchain. So you basically need a Celo US dollar oracle rate to be even able to set up the system that I just explained. Additionally, as a second point that makes this harder than it looks like, in a contraction cycle, you need to be able to offer somebody $1 worth of reserve collateral. You're not by definition able to do that. If there is no value in the reserve, then you cannot offer somebody $1 worth of anything. So you need to make sure that the reserve is always funded and has enough value in it, such that during contractions, it's able to redeem reserve collateral one-to-one, basically, for a Celo dollar. And I will speak about these 2 points in a bit more detail now. So the first point, oracle rate risk. Let me actually quickly go back to this figure to explain what I mean by that. So we said that we need a oracle rate to be able to identify how much to hand out to a user who sends $1 Celo to the reserve. Now, if this oracle rate will always be right, always be exactly precise, then this is a pretty simple mechanism, and it basically works as depicted here. But we just know from other protocols and experience that these oracle rates can be off for timing reasons, because they are manipulated in some form or another, or maybe even because market rates are manipulated for a moment, which basically makes the rate not really reflect a fair market valuation. So there are multiple reasons for why the rate that is used on chain is actually not reflecting the fair Celo US dollar rate. And if that's the case, if this risk exists, then you need to find a way to be robust against it, because otherwise people will take advantage of the reserve in such a situation and either buy too much Celo out of the reserve with Celo dollars, or buy too many Celo dollars from the reserve with Celo tokens, depending on in which direction the price is off. So we realized that this is the case and wanted to make sure that we build in a robustness feature that protects the Celo reserve against imprecisions in the oracle rate. And what we use for that is something that's very similar to how a Uniswap exchange works. The idea here is that you basically want to find a way that prices adjust on chain to one-sided trading in a way that if you are ever off with the oracle rate, that people can benefit of the reserve a bit, but at some point the price will have adjusted on chain, and this arbitrage opportunity against the reserve vanishes. That's the high-level idea. And the Uniswap setup helps with this. So how does a Uniswap exchange like that work conceptually? You can visualize basically the mathematics behind this as follows. Imagine you have 2 tanks, and those 2 tanks hold Celo tokens and Celo dollar tokens respectively. And then you just define that the price to interact with these tanks is always, at every point in time, the ratio of the tank quantities. So for example, if we say the Celo US dollar rate was 5, we could set up the exchange with the reserve on chain to reflect that rate by setting Celo dollar and Celo tanks of 500 and 100. Then the ratio of the tank quantities would be 5. And now somebody could either buy Celo dollars out of the Celo dollar tank or buy Celo out of the Celo tank at the price of 5 and move the price by doing that, because they will move these tanks. And now, why does that protect against oracle rate risk? So let's assume that the oracle rate was 5, but the fair market rate was actually $5.02. Okay, maybe the oracle rate is just slightly off for timing reasons. It took a couple of seconds before the rate really arrived on chain. There's a certain block time and all these things. So it could be just a timing issue. So the fair market rate would be $5.02, but we set a rate of 5 when these tanks were set up. Now, somebody has an incentive to sell a Celo dollar to the reserve because you actually get a bit more Celo in return from the reserve than you should compared to the fair market rate. Now, how does that work out in terms of the mathematics here, in terms of the prices? Well, if somebody sent one Celo dollar to the reserve, this person would, at the price of 5, get, roughly speaking, 0.2 Celo out of the reserve in the setup. It's roughly speaking because you actually take the integral over this pricing function. So it's slightly different, but it's very close to 0.2. And then the new tank quantities would be $5.1. This additional Celo dollar token would end up in the tank, and 0.2 would be missing from the Celo tank. And now the price would have moved to $5.02. And it's interesting because now actually the price is where it should have been in the first place. It's at the fair market rate. And it got there by arbitrage incentives. It basically said, it started out at 5, but it set incentives for people to take advantage of the reserve. But if people start taking advantage of the reserve, this arbitrage opportunity actually vanishes. This protects against oracle rates being wrong because people can only take advantage of the reserve to a certain degree before prices adjust dynamically on chain. The second point I just pointed out in the contraction cycle is that the Celo reserve needs to be funded. Some more background on the Celo reserve, therefore. So on Celo, the Celo reserve holds Celo tokens, which can be understood as a seigniorage style asset at which or against which expansions and contractions happen. But there's also a basket of non-Celo crypto assets like Bitcoin, ETH, and currently also DAI in the reserve. This is to diversify reserve price risk. Then periodically, rates are rebalanced against the portfolio is rebalanced against these target weights. And these target weights can actually be changed via on-chain governance. So everybody can make proposals on which other currency to add there and how the portfolio weights actually should look like. All these funds then basically can be used during contractions of stable token supply. So if somebody sells Celo dollar to the reserve, currently this person would receive Celo units from the reserve, from this basket basically, in return. Okay, so to wrap up this conceptual understanding, the intuition basically behind the Celo stability mechanism, let's quickly recap the building blocks here. We have a Uniswap style exchange for what we often call internally the decentralized one-to-one transfers. So basically allowing one-to-one transfers like fiat-backed stablecoins, but in a decentralized way. Together with this dynamic pricing idea that the Uniswap part brings into that picture. Additionally, we need oracles for this to work. We need some oracle rates of the Celo US dollar exchange rate. We also need a reserve that is somehow managed, that is diversifying the reserve price risk. And last but not least, we need users to interact with the stability protocol. One subtle but very important point here, I think, is that the protocol is not expanding or contracting supply. It simply sets incentives for users to expand or contract supply whenever that's needed. But if users are not taking these arbitrage opportunities, if they are not interacting with the stability protocol, then no expansion or contraction is happening. So it's very important to understand that users really are driving these expansions and contractions in the end, and it's not the protocol forcing them in a certain way. Okay, I hope that gives a bit of background on kind of the category in which the Celo stable tokens fall, and also on the conceptual understanding of how this mechanism works and what the intuition basically behind is, what the pictures are that you can use to basically get a better feeling around how things work. Of course, an implementation is always a bit different, or usually a bit more complicated also, than this conceptual idea behind the mechanism. And therefore, I wanted to also use this talk to speak about the implementation here and what really the components are in the actual implementation and which role they are playing. And to do that, I basically just listed out the components here that that I think are basically the relevant pieces of this whole setup. And I will then go into more detail for all of them. So first of all, what are the components? We have an exchange smart contract that actually allows to buy and sell against the reserve. We have the reserve smart contract that manages or holds the Celo stable value assets and also manages other things around the reserve. We have sorted oracles, which is handling the median calculation on chain. Stable token as a smart contract that is basically the implementation of the Celo dollar and other stable value assets, which will come in the future probably. And then we have off-chain components as well that are important for this to work. We have the Oracle clients, which are feeding the sorted Oracle smart contracts with the Oracle rates. We have the Hummingbot Celo arbitrage bot that is supposed to make it easy for users to interact with the stability mechanism, because as I pointed out, if nobody's interacting with it and taking arbitrage opportunities, then nobody's actually expanding or contracting supply. So that felt important to have as a component as well. And then there's the last component here, which is the reserve rebalancing side of things, which makes sure that this reserve portfolio is rebalanced to target allocations that are deemed by the community as something that diversifies the risks in the best possible way. Let's go through all of them in a bit more detail and discuss what they do, what their role is. Exchange.sol, the exchange smart contract. This is where you can sell Celo to the reserve for Celo dollars, or where you can sell Celo dollars to the reserve for Celo. It implements this, this bucket idea with this dynamic pricing in the Uniswap style that I talked about. There are a couple of details in the implementation that were omitted in basically these pictures in kind of when I conveyed the intuition behind the mechanism. First of all, it's not exactly true that you get exactly $1 worth of collateral from the reserve if you send a Celo dollar to the reserve via this exchange smart contract. There's a spread that is charged on every trade, and I will speak later about why this spread feels important. The exchange.sol smart contract also determines in the end the bucket sizes of these tanks. Now, in our example, we had tank sizes of 500 and 100, which led to a price of 5 because it's just a ratio of those quantities. We could also set up the same example basically with 5 million and 1 million in those tanks. And as we will see, on-chain liquidity is determined a lot by the overall tank sizes, and determining these tank sizes, that's something that exchange.sol smart contract also handles. Additionally, you will find the bucket update criteria in exchange.sol. So once in a while, these buckets will be reset to create new arbitrage incentives for expansions and contractions. And what the criteria are to reset those buckets, this is also implemented as part of exchange.sol. I will speak about all of these three things, bucket sizes, update criteria, and the spreads, later in the section about the important parameters in the setup and shed some light on how they affect the whole system. Sorted oracles. This allows Oracle clients to report the Celo US dollar rate to the blockchain. It keeps track of the median Oracle rate, the median over all the reported rates, in O1 on chain, which is nice and very efficient. It also does a couple of other things to just keep track of everything. It allows to remove expired reports. It allows to add new Oracle addresses to the set of addresses, which are able to report. Okay, what else do we have on chain? We have the reserve smart contract. This holds the reserve Celo balance. It also implements what we call the Celo reserve unfreezing. And the idea behind that is that to bootstrap this reserve, well, we need to be careful how basically to get to the target weights. Initially, the reserve has a lot of Celo tokens and a small initial allocation of Bitcoin and so forth, but basically an overweighted allocation in Celo tokens, just because in the Genesis block there were a lot of Celo tokens allocated to the reserve to already underpin stability as much as possible. But if you take the target weights and you are trying to rebalance toward those target weights, well, then this can mean that while bootstrapping the reserve, well, if you rebalance early on and you have a lot of Celo tokens in there, you might have to sell a lot of Celo tokens immediately. And that can cause just, turbulences on the market. So we wanted to avoid that. And therefore wanted to make sure that this is a smoother process in which the Celo reserve is basically bootstrapped. And therefore, in reserves.small, there is an unfreezing schedule basically implemented that makes sure that the Celo reserve receives those Celo tokens slowly over time to make this a less interruptive process and less, a process that is less prone to put a lot of downwards pressure on market prices, for example. Additionally, in reserve.sol, you will find a daily spend limit. Currently, this is at 5%. So the reserve spender is only able to take up to 5% per day out of the reserve for rebalancing purposes. And this is just a security measure that even if all the keys in the world are compromised, nobody can take more than 5% a day out, and just a safety feature here. Additionally, reserve.sol implements what we call the Tobin tax. The Tobin tax is currently not active, but it's an additional stability feature that the community could turn on at some point if it finds it useful and think that it will help with overall stability. The idea of the Tobin tax is basically that a small fee is charged on every Celo transfer on the protocol, and that this fee is going to the reserve. So if the reserve ratio ever becomes critically low, the community could turn on this Tobin tax, make sure that the reserve is receiving additional funds from everything that's going on the Celo blockchain. Additionally, reserve.sol keeps track of the reserve target asset allocation. So if you want to make a governance proposal to add additional assets to the reserve or change the weights of the reserve allocation, this will touch also reserve.sol because this is where this is kept track of. And last but not least, on the smart contract side, we have the stable token smart contract, which implements the Celo dollar and of course potentially other Celo stable assets in the future. It's an ERC20 compliant token that's generated there. It has a couple of additional features, especially around the stability fee. That's something that's also currently not active, but that basically reflects the economic idea of demurrage. It allows to charge basically a fee on holding stable value assets. A small fee, something like 0.5% per year, for example, could be an order of magnitude here on your Celo dollar holdings. And why would you do that? Well, you can basically influence the velocity of money by setting such a fee. And there are a lot of economic studies that show a lot of positive impacts if you implement something like that. So definitely something that gives additional leeway if this is deemed economically desirable by the community at some point. Okay, those were basically the smart contracts, so on-chain components basically. There are a couple of things that are happening off-chain. First of all, the Oracle clients. We need some code that fetches the Celo dollar US dollar price information from exchanges and then provides this information to the sorted Oracle's smart contract. Currently, these clients compute a volume-weighted mean mid price across all the exchanges where Celo US dollar is listed, and they implement a range of data robustness methods and checks to make sure that if a certain exchange goes wild or if the spread is increasing too much at a certain exchange, that all these things are handled in the robustest way possible. So these clients basically fetch this information, calculate an aggregate price, and report that price periodically to sorted oracles. We also have this Celo Hummingbot arbitrage bot, basically, that allows users to interact with the Celo stability mechanism. As I said before, the protocol is not expanding or contracting monetary supply. It's the users that are doing that in response to arbitrage incentives that are presented to them. And because we realized that we wanted to make sure that the barrier of entry for a non-technical user is low to actually engage in in providing stability by taking these arbitrage opportunities. So we engaged with Hummingbot, and they built this open source bot that interacts with the stability mechanism and thereby helps with the Celo dollar stability. The Hummingbot not only helps with expansions and contractions in the stability mechanism, but it also helps with on-chain liquidity. Because if there is a big trade in one direction while liquidity on-chain is low, well, this moves the price pretty strongly in one direction, and Hummingbot would basically bring it back to where it should have been, basically close to the market rate again, which makes sure that the next user interacting with the reserve can get a fair price again. So it helps also providing additional liquidity on chain. And last but not least, on the off-chain component side, the reserve rebalancing. This reserve portfolio, as I said, needs to be periodically rebalanced against target weights. And this is currently conducted off-chain. Of course, the goal is to fully automate this in the future and to have everything happening on the smart contract level, right? For that to be possible, you need cross-chain interoperability, right? You need bridges and other solutions that help you, for example, to sell Bitcoin to Ether in a smart contract on Celo. And I think the tech is just not really ready for that yet to fully automate this process. But it's one of the big goals to get there as soon as possible. If you want to learn more about how the reserve works, what the current holdings are in the reserve, and so forth, please check out celoreserve.org. You will find a lot of information there. Okay, I hope that at this point, everybody has a good understanding about the intuition behind the Celo stability mechanism, and also about how the actual implementation looks like and what the components are. I want to speak now a bit about some of the most important parameters in the setup and how they influence everything. The parameters I chose here to highlight are basically all parameters that you will find coming into play in exchange.sol, the exchange smart contract. The smart contract where you can basically sell Celo tokens to the reserve or get Celo dollars or sell Celo dollars to the reserve. The first one I want to start with here is the spread. As I said before, a spread is charged for every interaction with the reserve currently. And I think it's important to show the trade-off when setting this parameter and also the subsequent ones that I will talk about. So let's start with why it would be good to set this as small as possible. Well, assume that the spread is at 10%, just to make an extreme case here. Well, this basically means if you sell a Celo dollar to the reserve, you will only get 90 cents worth of reserve collateral in return. This obviously directly impacts the Celo dollar US dollar arbitrage bounds. If you remember the contraction case that we spoke about, with a spread of 10%, you wouldn't have an incentive anymore to buy a Celo dollar at 95 cents and sell it to the reserve, right? You would buy it at 95 cents, sell it to the reserve and get 90 cents for it. So you'd actually make a loss or incur a loss. So obviously the spread basically more or less directly determines Celo dollar US dollar arbitrage bounds. And you from that perspective would want to set it as low as possible to make sure that there are arbitrage bounds that push back the price to one basically as much as possible, as soon as possible, as as little as deviation as possible in this trading band. Additionally, a downside, of course, of setting the spread to a non-zero value is that it generates losses for users, right? If a user sells Celo dollars to the reserve but only gets 99.5 cents for the Celo dollar, then this is a loss for the user. So also a very good argument to set it to zero or extremely low. There are good arguments for setting it large though, and this is the trade-off I wanted to speak about. Of course, the losses for users is a win for the reserve. So all the money here, all that's charged in terms of the spread is flowing to the reserve. So this helps with long-term stability. If people are interacting with the reserve a lot, there will be a lot of reserve inflows, reserve collateral will grow, and this will, in the end, guarantee long-term stability for the Celo dollar as it provides more collateral for future contractions. So, what's bad for some users here is then, on the other hand, also good for some users because it underpins long-term stability of the Celo dollar. But I think even more importantly, the spread protects the reserve against two different things. First, if there are small imprecisions in the oracle rate during these bucket updates in the exchange, well, assume there is no spread at all. Then even if you're only by 0.1% off in the oracle rate, somebody can already take advantage of the reserve. Somebody can trade with the reserve at an unfair price and take advantage of the reserve in this regard. If you have a spread, currently it's at 0.5%. If you have such a spread, then basically the error in the oracle rate must be somewhat bigger than the spread before the reserve is really hurt by a trading, right? You basically give the oracle rate some slack in precision by creating a spread. Additionally, as a second protection here, the spread protects the reserve against impermanent loss. So if you look at Uniswap-related literature, you'll find the expression impermanent loss quite often. It basically states that if liquidity providers, in our case only the reserve, set up these tanks, these buckets, and then the market price moves in one direction by quite a bit, then these liquidity providers actually incur an impermanent loss. They basically incur a loss compared to the situation where they would have just held the initial amounts that they put into the tanks. It turns out you can actually avoid this impermanent loss to a big degree if you charge a spread and then also make sure that you update buckets somewhat frequently, which is already speaking to the next parameter here. This is because if you have an updating frequency of X and the price has moved less than the spread in this time amount of X, then basically nothing has pushed these buckets around, and therefore no impermanent loss occurred. So you basically just spin down the buckets again, spin up new buckets that are now at a new rate, but the reserve didn't really encounter any loss in the process. So basically, if the spread is chosen in line with the updating frequency here, you can make sure that in most of the cases, during normal market times where market prices don't move like crazy, that you usually avoid the impermanent loss during normal times. Okay, let's go to the next one, update frequency. This determines, and I spoke about it a bit already, this determines the updating frequency of these exchange buckets. And it's important to understand here that basically when the reserve sets these buckets, in this moment, the arbitrage opportunity is generated to expand or contract monetary supply if the Celo dollar is depegged. But afterwards, when this arbitrage opportunity is taken once, no additional expansions or contractions happen. That basically means if you would only update buckets once and then never touch them again, you would set arbitrage opportunities once that lead to helpful contractions or expansions, but afterwards, this is not happening anymore. So you basically don't have a stability mechanism in some sense. So basically, never updating these buckets and resetting them is not an option. What is the other extreme? If you reset them basically after every trade that's happening, then you lose the reserve protection that is coming from this dynamic price adjustment. Why is that? Well, if the oracle rate is wrong and you set the tanks, now somebody trades at that price and you directly reset the tanks again to this wrong oracle rate, then the dynamic price adjustment on chain didn't even really kick in. And therefore, you also didn't gain anything pretty much from even having these buckets, right? You could just set the price to the oracle rate all the time. So I think these extreme cases show that the updating frequency shouldn't be, infinitely small, but it also shouldn't be, infinitely large. It should be somewhere in between. And what we tried to do here as an initial suggestion to the community is to choose it in line with the spread to make sure that the impermanent loss is, usually avoided, and then also analyzed how quick the reaction would be in terms of contracting and expanding Celo dollar supply if we set it to a certain value. So we came up with 5 minutes here as a good value to solve this trade-off initially. The figure here on the right, and yeah, just to clarify that, those are the exchange rates. U is standing for US dollars, G is standing for Celo tokens. They were once called gold, therefore the G, and C is standing for Celo dollars. So basically the green line down here shows a case, a simulation where the Celo dollar starts out quite depacked, and we look at iterations, which are bucket updates, and how the price comes back in those bucket updates if all the arbitrage opportunities are taken, and how this also affects the other market rates if you make certain assumptions about arbitrage freeness in the market. And what you see there is that it takes a couple of updates, a couple of iterations, a couple of bucket updates basically, until the stable token fully regains its peg. And therefore also high updating frequency basically helps, because then these iterations take place in a shorter period of time. Okay, last but definitely not least on the parameter side is the reserve fraction. There's actually a governance proposal out just now to increase the reserve fraction. And you'll find a lot of context around it in these governance proposals. That's why I will keep this a bit short. But this basically determines the on-chain liquidity when you interact with the reserve. It sets up the total size of these tanks, these buckets that we talked about, and therefore determines speed of adjustment of the price on-chain, and also the speed of adjustment of Celo dollar supply. The trade-off that you need to solve here is between how quickly are we adjusting Celo dollar supply if there's a DPEG, and how much do we protect the reserve against oracle rate risk. And initially we set this value to a very low value of 0.1% when the stability protocol was activated. And we proposed that to the community because we felt like it's important to make sure that the whole system is working as expected, that oracle rates are reliable, and to protect the reserve initially, basically, as much as possible. And now, after things have played out very well over the first weeks, the proposal is out to increase this value to 0.5%, which helps with on-chain liquidity and therefore makes it easier for people to interact with the reserve and exchange Celo dollars, for example, for Celo tokens in a more cost-efficient way. So here, the downside of setting this reserve fraction very high on the left, if you set it too high, this also means that the reserve protection potential is pretty low, and you will have a lot of outflows from the Celo reserve if the oracle rate is ever off. So this is basically showing a simulated case where the oracle rate was quite off for a while, and therefore people took advantage of the reserve to a large degree because the reserve fraction was also high, and basically trained 100 million Celo. Yeah, we basically model a worst case scenario if the reserve fraction is extremely high. 100 million Celo basically from the reserve. So if you set it way too high, and if you have totally off oracle rates for a large amount of time, then this is kind of the worst case scenario you're seeing here. This compares to a case where the reserve fraction is much smaller. Then you will see that the outflow in response to manipulated oracle rates is just much smaller, so the reserve is more protected, even if this manipulation stands for quite some time. Okay, before I close this talk and answer questions that you hopefully will have, I wanted to give a bit of an outlook on what's to come, and what the current thinking is, and what improvement proposals are that are already discussed somewhere, whether on Discord or in a more private gathering, and also speak a bit about the long-term challenges that the stability side just has, and that it would be great to get community feedback on. So first, there are already Celo improvement proposals out there, and this is great. And I think I cannot repeat this enough. Getting a stability system like the one we are building here right is an extremely difficult task. And we are not claiming that this is the perfect solution and that we have figured every little detail out in the best way possible. So we are actively looking for improvement proposals. I think there is a lot to make more robust and to improve going forward. And 2 proposals are out there already, which is great to see from the community. One is to add Zcash to the Celo reserve, another asset. This could help with further diversification of the reserve portfolio, but also could help engage, for example, the Zcash community in building interoperability solutions on Celo that connect, Celo and Zcash, for example, by a bridge. So very exciting proposal. You should all take a look if you're interested. And then another one is out there that is basically proposing to add a new exchange function that allows you to buy a fixed amount of tokens for a maximum price. So this is more of a usability proposal. It is supposed to improve how you interact with the reserve in a way that people are used to from interacting with centralized exchanges. So I think it's a great proposal to make this easier for users to buy a certain amount of tokens as they're used to. And there are a couple of other stability-related improvements, openly discussed here and there. Just in terms of the timing here, I don't want to dive in too much detail, but you could, for example, add a cap size on the Celo dollar tank size to make sure that not only the reserve fraction is driving bucket updates, but that you always have also a Celo dollar tank size, which is not out of proportion compared to the Celo dollar supply. So something like that would probably be very easy to add and could add a lot of value in extreme cases. There is definitely, I think, a way here or a need here to think about Oracle circuit breakers on chain that would just provide additional robustness against manipulated Oracle rates. We were thinking about making on-chain liquidity more dynamic so we don't have to update the reserve fraction parameter by governance proposals once in a while, but basically find a way for this to happen more naturally on-chain. So definitely something to think about. If you have ideas there, please reach out. And then something I'm definitely very excited about as an idea is to allow also non-reserve liquidity providers. Currently in this bucket setup, the bucket side or the tanks are basically set up by the reserve and nobody else can contribute to the liquidity here. And one solution to liquidity constraints on chain could be that you just allow other users to do that as well and earn, for example, a bit of the spread that is charged as compensation for taking the risk here. And last but not least, of course, at some point it would be great to have additional Celo stable tokens on the platform. And I think this is something that we should all think about and figure out which stable tokens could be interesting here.
Sure, Roman, we have close to the closing hours. We want to leave a few minutes. Can we move forward to the next slide?
Yeah. Long-term challenges. Yeah, I think in terms of time, I will not speak too much about them, but it will definitely be nice to understand more about how we can diversify reserve price risk and also how we can decentralize basically the reserve rebalancing. But yeah, please, Judy, take over here.
Thank you, Roman. Before we move on to the Q&A, we have a couple of minutes for the Q&A. I'd like to give a brief preview of the next week's Celo Tech Talk. Celo's mainnet was launched as a fully decentralized distributed system with the full nodes and validators run and operate 100% by Celo validators community from day one, we're very proud about that. And every aspect of Celo, from its design to implementation to operation, is driven by end users' needs and their use cases. For this reason, how we upgrade the system also goes through Celo community, driven by governance process. And many of the governance proposals are put forward and approved and processed to continue to harden Celo Platform as a financial system that creates conditions of prosperity for everyone, including the reserve fraction that Roman mentioned earlier today. And one of the most recent governance proposals also involves around the stabilizing the system. So if you're interested in how the governance process works on Celo Platform, this is the session that you don't want to miss. And so next week, Amy Slauson and York Rose, 2 protocol engineering partners, will give a deep dive session on how that governance process actually works. So looking forward to seeing everyone there. Back to you, Roman, and we have a couple of questions on the Ask a Question tab.
Yes, I see one question about
Oh,
recording availability. I think that was already
yep,
answered. So there definitely will be a
yep.
recording available with this. And then the second
Thank you,
question,
Nelson.
yeah, thank you, Nelson, for answering this. And then also, how is the stability fee limit on the stable coin without breaking the US dollar peg? Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting question. So first of all, I think the orders of magnitude we are speaking about here are something like 0.5% a year. Like this order of magnitude, I think, is something realistic that we could think about at some point to put into place. That would basically mean if you hold 100 Celo dollars for a year and basically don't touch them, you would then at the end of the year only have 99.5 Celo dollars. So it's, I think, economically speaking, a very low fee. That can still have positive impacts on money velocity. The stability mechanism would still work as before. It's more that I think long-term holders of Celo would get an incentive to transact more and not hoard these Celo tokens, Celo dollar tokens in their wallet as much. Of course, you could argue that this is a DPEG if you basically hold a token and after a year, it only has 99.5% of its value. And I think that's a fair point to make. But I think it's basically a DPEG for which you need to balance here the benefits versus the costs. And it's not clear, whether it should be out there as well at all, the stability fee. There are good arguments for not having it. But there are also good arguments for having it, because if you can positively impact, for example, money velocity by charging it, then it's probably worth this loss to end users, the small loss to end users over the course of a year. Any other questions?
Doesn't look like there's any other questions. Not even the
Nothing else
text.
so far.
Yep. Yep. Oh, there's one more question. On that case, why not use DeFi to get interest on my dollars?
Yeah, I think there's no reason to not do that. And it will be exciting to see what DeFi applications will come to Celo, probably also migrate from other platforms to Celo. I expect these things to build up, and of course, also with a stability fee. Of course, the question is, you basically charge a negative interest rate on Celo dollars, so it's a fair question to say, why should somebody hold a stable token like that instead of just holding a token that probably pays a slightly positive interest rate? And that's a fair question to ask. I guess it depends a bit on what you can do with this token, on whether this will impact demand a lot. But it's definitely something to consider when together as a community we at some point think about whether we bring the stability fee into action or not.
And we have one more question. Would be interesting to see what your thoughts and analysis are around how Celo versus USD liquidity affects the peg, and how spread volatility of a Celo USD would affect USD, Celo USD versus USD peg.
That's a great question. On the first point, the most immediate thing that comes to my mind around Celo US dollar liquidity and the peg is the risk here. If Celo US dollar liquidity in the market is very low, and it started out fairly low, then this has a tendency to make it easier to push market prices around without incurring much of a cost there. So basically, if your order books are not deeply filled, you can just sell a bunch of Celo tokens in this Celo US dollar order book on some exchange, and thereby push down the price quite a bit. Now, one of the big reasons why we set the reserve fraction parameter so low initially, or proposed to set it so low, was that we wanted to make sure that nobody is able to push around market prices very cheaply, and then take advantage of the reserve by trading at this unfair price, basically, with the reserve. So Celo US dollar liquidity definitely is important for the peg and also for protecting the reserve. And I think the on-chain liquidity basically needs to match this market liquidity or be a bit below it for things to be really safe. So I think it's very important for the stability mechanism in general that this liquidity keeps on evolving and that we also generate more interest in the overall crypto market for Celo tokens. And then on the second point, that's also a great one. So if there is a big spread on the Celo US dollar rate, then basically the Oracle rate is by definition imprecise, right? You basically don't really know what a good mid price is. You only have, a bid price and an ask price, which are pretty far away from each other. So you basically have a range of uncertainty in the middle. And the best you can probably do is to just, use the mid price and assume that this is a fair evaluation of the price. Now, if there is a 20% bid ask spread, then this becomes a very, very bad estimate of a fair value because basically everything in this region could be a fair market value. So what's happening currently in the Oracle clients is that there are checks implemented, for example, to make sure that if the spread is becoming too wide, that on a certain exchange, then this mid price on this exchange is ignored because you can basically not really derive precise information from such a pair trading with such a big spread. And to cover the second part of the question, I think if the spread is very wide, therefore it would also be very hard. So let's say the spread keeps on being very wide at a very big part of all the exchanges from which the Oracle rate is fetched, then this is risky because it basically forces the stability mechanism in some sense to set an Oracle rate or set the buckets to an Oracle rate, which is very imprecisely measured. So I think the overall sentiment here, at least in the economics team here at CLabs, is that if something ever basically seems wrong in such a regard, for example, if it seems very hard to actually measure what a fair market valuation for Celo dollar US dollar is, then it's better to not update buckets and to basically pause the stability mechanism for a while, compared to a case where you run into the danger of updating buckets at an unfair rate and therefore exposing the reserve to risk. So in general, I think this is how we would deal with this case of wide spreads. Probably, postpone updating bucket sizes for a while on chain by not providing Oracle rates, for example. But in some sense, you can, well, if you set up all the equations and you assume arbitrage freeness, you can basically work out that the Celo US dollar rate is pretty closely related to the Celo dollar US dollar, peg band if there is basically a spread on the Celo dollar US dollar rate. It's a pretty much one-to-one comparison. And I think there's something about this in the Celo stability analysis where we look at that case. We definitely did some analysis there at some point. I think it made it into the paper.
Thank you, Ziviad, Marco, BC for your questions, and Nelson for helping to answer the questions. Right, I think we're all set. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Until next time.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye.